"Don't dig there, Rex, it's just rock," Jack muttered, but the dog didn't move, not even when the wind howled through the canyon like a warning that had arrived too late. The sun was sinking behind the jagged ridgeline, casting long shadows across the barren stretch of land Jack Turner had inherited without ceremony, without explanation, and without any real value as far as he could tell. 10 acres of stone, dust, and silence somewhere outside Moab, Utah, worth less than the paperwork it came with. He had seen worse places overseas, places that carried memories he tried hard not to revisit, but this one felt different in a way he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the stillness, or maybe it was the way Rex had frozen the moment they stepped out of the truck, ears alert, muscles tense, like he'd walked into a room where something unseen was already watching. Jack adjusted his flannel jacket against the cold desert air and exhaled slowly, his breath visible in the fading light, while Rex stood 10 feet ahead, pawing at a narrow crevice between 2 massive slabs of stone that looked like they had been split apart centuries ago. "It's nothing," Jack said again, more to himself this time, his voice quieter, less certain, but Rex responded with a low, persistent growl, the kind that didn't come from fear, but from recognition. The sound sent a subtle chill down Jack's spine, the kind that had nothing to do with the temperature dropping fast now that the sun was nearly gone. He walked closer, boots crunching over loose gravel, each step echoing slightly against the rock walls, and watched as Rex scraped harder, claws striking the surface with sharp, rhythmic taps that didn't quite sound like stone. Jack paused. That sound, it wasn't right. He crouched down, brushing away dust with his hand, revealing a patch of surface smoother than the surrounding rock, too flat, too deliberate. "What did you find, huh?" he murmured, more curious now than skeptical, his fingers tracing the edge where rough stone met something else, something that didn't belong to nature. Rex stopped digging for a moment and looked back at him, eyes steady, almost expectant, as if waiting for Jack to finally see what had been there all along. The wind picked up again, sweeping through the canyon and carrying with it a faint, hollow whisper that seemed to pass right through the narrow gap in the rocks. Jack leaned in, pressing his palm lightly against the surface, and felt it, just barely, a subtle difference in temperature, like the space beyond it held its own breath. His heartbeat slowed, then deepened, the rhythm grounding him in a moment that felt strangely familiar, like standing at the edge of something he had once known but buried deep enough to forget. "This isn't just a hole," he said under his breath, the words forming before he fully understood them. Behind him, the truck sat silent, a distant reminder of the world he came from, but here, in this narrow cut of stone, time felt different, stretched thin between what was visible and what was hidden. Rex let out a short bark, sharp and certain, then resumed scratching at the same spot, more urgent now, more focused, as if whatever lay beyond that sealed surface wasn't just important, it was waiting. Jack swallowed, his throat suddenly dry, and reached back toward his pack for the small folding shovel he almost hadn't bothered bringing. He hesitated for just a second, eyes fixed on that unnatural line carved into the rock, then exhaled slowly. "All right," he said, quieter this time, not arguing anymore. "Let's see what you're trying to tell me." The first strike of the shovel sounded dull, almost hesitant, as if the ground itself resisted being disturbed, and Jack paused after that single motion, his breath steady but his mind alert in a way it had not been in years, the kind of alertness that did not come from danger but from something deeper, something unfinished. Rex stood close now, no longer scratching, just watching, his ears forward and his body still, as though he understood that whatever came next required patience instead of force. Jack adjusted his grip and pressed the shovel again into the seam where the smooth surface met the rough stone, applying more pressure this time, feeling the edge slide just slightly into the gap. A faint crack followed, not loud, not dramatic, but enough to confirm what his instincts had already begun to whisper. This was not natural. He set the shovel aside and used both hands, brushing away more dust, exposing a wider section of the surface, revealing lines that were too straight, too intentional to belong to the earth. Someone had placed this here. Someone had sealed this. The thought settled in slowly, carrying with it a quiet weight that pulled at something in his chest, something tied to memories he had spent years learning how to ignore. The wind softened for a moment, and in that brief stillness, Jack leaned closer, pressing his ear near the surface, not expecting anything, and yet he held there longer than necessary, as if waiting for a sound that might never come. There was nothing. Just silence. But it was not empty. It felt contained, like a room behind a closed door. He pulled back, exhaling slowly, and reached into his pack again, this time pulling out a small pry bar, the metal catching the last light of the day. Rex shifted slightly, letting out a low, quiet sound, not warning, not fear, but something that felt almost like encouragement. "Easy," Jack said, more to steady himself than the dog, and slid the edge of the pry bar into the narrow opening he had created. He applied pressure carefully, testing, listening, feeling the resistance change beneath his hands, and then, after a few seconds, there it was again, a deeper crack, followed by a subtle movement in the surface. Dust fell in a thin stream, drifting down like ash, and Jack stepped back instinctively, his heart picking up just enough to remind him he was no longer just exploring empty land. He was uncovering something that had been hidden on purpose. The realization did not bring fear, not exactly, but it sharpened his focus, grounding him in the present moment, anchoring him in the physical task in front of him. He crouched again, working more deliberately now, widening the opening inch by inch, each movement controlled, each breath measured, until a section of the sealed surface shifted enough to reveal a narrow gap, no more than a few inches wide. From within, a faint breath of air slipped out, cooler than the desert night that was settling around them, carrying with it a subtle scent that Jack could not immediately place, something dry, something old, something untouched. Rex stepped closer, lowering his head toward the opening, sniffing carefully, then pulling back slightly, not retreating, just processing, as if confirming that whatever lay inside was not a threat but not ordinary either. Jack watched him for a moment, trusting that instinct more than his own reasoning, then leaned forward again, peering into the darkness beyond the gap. There was no immediate detail, just shadow layered over shadow, but the space felt larger than he expected, deeper than a simple cavity in the rock. His fingers tightened slightly around the pry bar, not from fear, but from the growing certainty that this place, this sealed pocket hidden inside what everyone else would have dismissed as useless land, was connected to something real, something human. He widened the gap a little more, enough now for his hand to pass through, and paused again, the moment stretching, the silence pressing in, until finally he spoke, his voice low, steady, but carrying a weight he could not quite explain. "Someone did not want this found," he said quietly, and for the first time since arriving, he was no longer thinking about what the land was worth, but about why it had been given to him at all. Jack did not move right away after his own words settled into the cold air, as if saying them aloud had made the truth heavier, more real, and for a moment he simply knelt there beside the narrow opening, listening to the quiet, steady rhythm of his own breathing and the faint shifting of gravel under Rex's paws. The dog leaned in again, slower this time, his nose hovering just inches from the gap, drawing in the scent that drifted from within, then pulling back with a soft exhale, his ears twitching as though he was trying to understand something just beyond instinct. Jack watched him carefully, reading that behavior the same way he once read distant movement on a horizon, not jumping to conclusions, not forcing meaning too quickly, just observing, letting the moment speak. The air coming from inside was cooler now that the opening had widened, brushing against his knuckles with a steady, almost deliberate flow, and that detail alone told him this space was deeper than it appeared, not just a shallow pocket but something with structure, something that held its own air. He reached into his pack again, pulling out a small flashlight, the kind he carried out of habit rather than expectation, and clicked it on, the beam cutting a narrow line through the darkness as he angled it toward the opening. At first, the light revealed nothing but dust drifting slowly in the air, tiny particles suspended as though time moved differently inside that space, but as he adjusted the angle, shifting his wrist slightly, the beam caught something else, something flat, something vertical, and for a brief second, his breath caught without him meaning it to. It was not just a hollow space. It was a room. Not large, not open, but defined, contained, with walls that looked too even, too shaped to be natural. He leaned closer, widening the gap just enough to bring the light deeper inside, his movements careful, deliberate, as if he understood that rushing now would only blur what needed to be seen clearly. The beam slid across the interior, revealing rough stone that had been cut or reinforced, the edges softened by time but still unmistakably intentional, and then it landed on something that did not belong to the walls at all. A surface. Flat. Rectangular. Positioned slightly off the ground. Jack stilled completely, his hand tightening just enough around the flashlight to steady it, and for a long second he did not move, did not breathe any differently, just let his eyes adjust, let the shape come into focus without forcing it. Rex shifted beside him, letting out a low, questioning sound, and Jack responded without looking away. "I see it," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper, not out of fear, but out of respect for the silence that filled the space. He extended the pry bar again, widening the opening another inch, then another, until the gap was large enough for him to angle his shoulder closer, bringing the light fully inside. The rectangular object came into clearer view now, its edges worn but intact, its surface coated in a thin layer of dust that had settled undisturbed for years, maybe longer, and something about its placement, about the way it rested there, not abandoned but preserved, sent a slow, steady realization through him. This was not hidden in a hurry. This had been sealed with purpose. He drew the light upward, scanning the wall behind it, and that was when he saw the markings, faint but unmistakable, lines carved into the surface in a pattern that was not random, not natural erosion, but deliberate, structured, almost like a code or a memory left behind in stone. His chest tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition of something deeper than logic, something that brushed against the edges of his past in a way he could not yet define. Rex stepped closer again, placing one paw lightly near Jack's knee, grounding him, reminding him he was not alone in this moment, and Jack let out a slow breath, steadying himself before leaning in just a little further. The beam of light dipped once more, tracing the outline of the rectangular object, and then settling on a small detail near its edge, something metallic, something that caught the light differently than everything else in that space. Jack narrowed his eyes, focusing, letting the image sharpen, and as it did, the air seemed to shift around him, not physically, but in the way a memory begins to rise before it is fully understood. "That is not just storage," he said under his breath, his voice quieter now, more certain, and for the first time since Rex had started digging, Jack felt the weight of the place not as curiosity, but as connection, as if whatever lay behind that sealed wall had been waiting, not just to be found, but to be found by him. Jack did not reach inside right away, even though the opening was now wide enough for his arm, because something about the space beyond demanded patience, the kind of patience he had learned long ago, when moving too fast meant missing the detail that mattered most. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from the tension of holding still while everything inside him urged him to understand what he was looking at. Rex shifted again, pressing closer, his body warm against Jack's side, his presence steady, grounding, and Jack lowered the light just enough to let his eyes adjust further to the interior. The rectangular object rested on a raised section of stone, almost like a shelf carved into the wall, and as the dust settled from the earlier movement, more of its surface became visible, revealing edges that were not just straight, but finished, as if someone had taken care to place it there with intention rather than haste. Jack exhaled slowly, then extended his hand through the gap, fingers brushing the cool air inside before making contact with the edge of the object. It was solid, heavier than it looked, and colder than the surrounding stone, holding a temperature that felt preserved, untouched by the outside world. He did not pull it out immediately. Instead, he let his fingers rest there, tracing along the edge, feeling the subtle imperfections, the faint ridges that spoke of age rather than damage. "This has been here a long time," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a weight that came from instinct more than evidence. Rex responded with a soft huff, as if agreeing, his eyes fixed on the opening, alert but calm. Jack adjusted his position, widening the gap just enough to slide his forearm inside, then carefully lifted the object, easing it toward him inch by inch, mindful not to disturb anything else within the space. As it cleared the opening, he brought it into the fading light of the canyon, holding it with both hands now, turning it slightly to catch what little daylight remained. It was a metal case, not large, about the length of his forearm, its surface dulled by time but intact, with a latch on one side that had been sealed, not locked, but deliberately closed in a way that suggested it was meant to stay that way until someone chose otherwise. Jack stared at it for a moment, the weight of it settling not just in his hands, but somewhere deeper, somewhere tied to the quiet realization that this was no accident, no random find. This had been placed here. Left here. For a reason. The wind picked up again, brushing past him, carrying the scent of dust and stone, but also something else now, something older, something that felt like memory rather than environment. He shifted his grip on the case, then looked back toward the opening, raising the flashlight once more and angling it inside. The markings on the wall seemed clearer now, the lines forming shapes that were not immediately readable, but not meaningless either, and as his eyes traced them, something flickered at the edge of his mind, not a full memory, not yet, but a recognition of pattern, of structure, of something he had seen before in a different place, under different circumstances. His jaw tightened slightly, and he drew the light back, lowering it as he leaned away from the opening. Rex let out a low sound, stepping forward and placing his nose briefly against the metal case, then pulling back, his ears tilting as if listening for something Jack could not hear. "You knew, did you not?" Jack murmured, not expecting an answer, but the dog's steady gaze felt like one anyway. He turned the case over in his hands, studying the latch more closely, noticing now that it was not corroded, not damaged, but simply sealed with a thin strip of material that had hardened over time, as if someone had intended for it to be opened, just not easily, not casually. Jack ran his thumb along that edge, feeling the slight give beneath the surface, and paused, his breath slowing, his thoughts aligning in a way they had not since he arrived. Behind him, the canyon stretched wide and empty, the last light fading into deep blue shadows, but here, in this narrow space between stone and silence, everything felt focused, drawn inward toward the object in his hands. "This land was not useless," he said quietly, more certain now than ever, and as he looked back at the sealed opening, then down at the case, the question that had been forming since the moment Rex first started digging finally took shape in his mind, clear and undeniable. Why him? Jack did not open the case right away, even though every instinct inside him told him that whatever answers he was searching for were sealed within it, because something deeper, something older, reminded him that rushing the moment would only cloud what needed to be understood clearly. He turned slightly, scanning the fading canyon around him, the sky now a deepening shade of blue as the last light slipped behind the horizon, and for the first time since Rex had started digging, he became aware of how quiet everything had grown, not just silent, but still in a way that felt almost intentional, as if the land itself was waiting for him to decide what came next. Rex remained close, his body angled toward Jack, his attention fixed not on the canyon, but on the case, his ears shifting with small, precise movements as though listening for something that existed beyond sound. Jack lowered himself onto a flat section of stone, setting the case carefully across his knees, the weight of it steady and grounding, and ran his fingers along the sealed edge again, feeling the hardened strip that held it shut. It was not a lock meant to keep someone out forever, just long enough to ensure that whoever opened it did so with purpose. He exhaled slowly, then reached into his pack once more, pulling out a small utility knife, the metal glinting faintly in the dim light. His movements were deliberate, controlled, each motion measured as he positioned the blade against the edge of the seal and applied just enough pressure to test its resistance. The material gave slightly, not brittle, not fragile, but aged, and as he worked the blade along the seam, a thin line began to separate, the sound soft but unmistakable in the quiet air. Rex shifted closer, sitting now, his posture calm but attentive, his gaze never leaving Jack's hands. "Easy," Jack murmured again, though this time the word felt more like a reminder to himself than to the dog, and he continued slowly, guiding the blade along the entire length of the seal until it loosened enough to peel back under his fingers. The moment the last section came free, Jack paused, his hand resting lightly on the lid, his breath steady but deeper now, as if he understood that whatever lay inside would not just answer questions, but create new ones. He lifted the latch carefully, the metal making a faint click that seemed louder than it should have, echoing softly against the stone around them, and then, with a controlled motion, he opened the case. Inside, the contents were arranged with a precision that immediately caught his attention, not scattered, not forgotten, but placed with care, preserved in a way that suggested intention rather than abandonment. A folded piece of fabric rested on one side, its color muted by time but still recognizable as something once worn, something personal. Beside it lay a small stack of papers, edges yellowed, corners slightly curled, but intact, protected by the enclosure of the case. And near the center, partially obscured by the shadow cast by the lid, was the metallic object he had seen earlier, now clearer in the dim light, its surface catching the beam of the flashlight as Jack angled it closer. He leaned in, his focus narrowing, his world shrinking to the space within the case, and as the details came into view, something shifted inside him, not sharply, not all at once, but slowly, like a memory rising through layers he had spent years keeping sealed. Rex let out a soft, low sound, almost a breath, and Jack glanced at him briefly before returning his gaze to the contents. "This was not just hidden," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying a depth that had not been there before. "This was left behind." He reached out, his fingers hovering just above the metallic object, hesitating for a fraction of a second before making contact, and the moment he did, a subtle recognition passed through him, not fully formed, not yet clear, but undeniable in its presence. The night had settled fully around them now, the canyon wrapped in darkness, but within that small circle of light, Jack understood something that changed the way he saw everything that had led him here. This was not random. This was not chance. And whatever story had been sealed inside that wall had been waiting, not just to be discovered, but to be remembered. Jack's fingers tightened slightly around the metallic object as he lifted it from the case, careful, steady, as if the weight of it extended beyond what his hands could measure, and for a moment he did not look directly at it, letting the sensation come first, the cold surface pressing against his palm, the edges worn just enough to suggest years of handling before it had been sealed away. Rex leaned in closer, his nose hovering inches from Jack's hand, then pulling back slowly, his ears shifting as though whatever Jack now held carried meaning even the dog could sense. Jack finally lowered his gaze, angling the flashlight so the beam fell cleanly across the object, and the details came into focus piece by piece, not all at once, but enough to make his breath pause in a way that felt involuntary. It was a military identification tag, the kind issued in pairs, the metal dulled but intact, the chain loop through it still attached, though coiled tightly from years of being confined in the case. He turned it slightly, the engraved surface catching the light, and as the letters became legible, something inside him shifted, not sharply, not violently, but with a quiet, undeniable pull that reached past logic and into memory. He did not speak right away. He did not need to. The name was familiar in a way that went deeper than recognition, deeper than coincidence, and as he stared at it, the canyon around him seemed to fall even quieter, as though the world had narrowed to that single point of connection between past and present. Rex sat beside him now, still and steady, his presence anchoring Jack in the moment, preventing him from drifting too far into whatever memory was beginning to surface. Jack exhaled slowly, his breath measured, controlled, the way it had been taught to him long ago, and with his free hand he reached back into the case, lifting the folded fabric carefully, revealing more of the contents beneath. The papers shifted slightly as he moved them, their edges fragile but intact, and he set them aside gently, his focus returning to the tag in his hand. He turned it again, reading the engraved lines once more, as if confirming that what he saw had not changed, that it was still there, still real, and not something his mind had created out of the silence and the weight of the place. "No," he said quietly, the word barely more than a breath, but it carried a depth that suggested not disbelief, but recognition arriving too quickly to process. The name on the tag belonged to someone he had not thought about in years, not because he had forgotten, but because remembering had never come easily, And now, here, in a place that should have meant nothing, it was impossible to ignore. He lowered his hand slightly, letting the tag rest against his palm, and glanced back toward the opening in the rock, the sealed space that had hidden this for so long, and the question that had formed earlier returned, stronger now, more focused. Why had this been left here? Why had it been given to him? Rex shifted again, placing a paw gently against Jack's knee, not pushing, not pulling, just there, a steady point of contact that grounded him in the present, and Jack nodded faintly, as if acknowledging something unspoken between them. He set the tag carefully on top of the case, then reached for the stack of papers, lifting them with both hands, mindful of their condition, and as he unfolded the first sheet, the sound of the paper moving through the quiet air seemed louder than it should have been, carrying with it the weight of words that had been waiting, unseen, for far too long. The flashlight beam followed his movement, illuminating the page, revealing lines of handwriting that were steady, deliberate, and unmistakably human, and as Jack's eyes began to move across the first line, the stillness around him deepened, not empty, not silent, but full of something that had finally begun to speak. Jack's eyes moved slowly across the page, each word settling into place with a weight that made the air feel thicker, as if the space around him had shifted from silence into presence, and the handwriting, steady and deliberate, carried a voice that felt both distant and unmistakably familiar. He did not rush it, did not skim, did not search ahead, because something in him understood that this was not just information, this was a message meant to be read the way it was written, one line at a time, with the same care that had placed it here. The first sentence alone was enough to tighten his chest, not from fear, but from recognition that arrived without warning, a recognition that did not yet have shape but already had weight. Rex remained still beside him, his breathing calm, his eyes fixed not on the paper but on Jack, as if reading the shift in him rather than the words themselves. Jack swallowed once, steadying himself, then continued, the beam of the flashlight unwavering now as it followed the lines downward. The letter spoke in a tone that was not desperate, not hurried, but certain, as if the writer had known exactly who would find it, even if time had stretched far beyond what either of them could have expected. There were references, small at first, details that might have meant nothing to anyone else, but to Jack they landed with quiet precision, each one brushing against memories he had kept locked away not out of fear, but out of necessity. Names that had not been spoken in years. Places that existed more in fragments than in full recollection. Moments that had been left unfinished. He paused for a second, his eyes lifting from the page, staring into the darkness beyond the narrow circle of light, as if the canyon itself might respond, as if the land might hold the rest of the story in its silence. It did not. But the feeling remained. He looked back down and continued reading, his voice now just barely audible, not for the sake of sound, but to anchor himself in the present as the past began to take shape around him. The writer spoke of choices, of things left undone, of something that had needed to be hidden not out of fear, but out of protection, and as Jack followed the words, the connection became clearer, not fully formed yet, but undeniable in its direction. This was not just a record. This was a hand reaching forward through time. Rex shifted slightly, pressing closer, and Jack's free hand instinctively rested against the dog's shoulder, grounding himself in something real, something immediate, while his mind traced the path the letter was laying out before him. The name on the tag, the markings on the wall, the case, the land itself, it was all beginning to align, not randomly, not coincidentally, but with a structure that felt intentional in a way that was almost impossible to ignore. He reached the next section of the letter, and the tone shifted, just slightly, becoming more direct, more personal, and Jack felt that change immediately, the way one feels a shift in the air before a storm, not dangerous, but undeniable. The words no longer described the past. They spoke to him. Not by name, not directly, but with a clarity that left no room for doubt. The letter had been written for whoever found it, but it had been meant for him. His jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in acceptance of something he had not yet fully understood, and he continued, slower now, more deliberate, letting each word settle fully before moving to the next. The final lines on the page were shorter, simpler, but carried more weight than everything that had come before, and as his eyes reached the end, he did not move for a long moment, the silence returning, but no longer empty, now filled with something that had been waiting, something that had finally been heard. He lowered the paper slightly, his gaze drifting toward the metal tag resting on the case, then back to the dark opening in the rock, and the question that had been forming since the beginning no longer felt like a question at all. It felt like an answer he was only just beginning to understand. Jack did not immediately reach for the next page, even though the urge to continue was there, steady and insistent, because something in the final lines of the first letter had shifted the ground beneath him in a way that required more than just reading to understand. He lowered the paper slowly, his hand resting against his knee, the edges of the page catching the faint beam of the flashlight as the wind moved softly through the canyon, carrying a quiet that no longer felt empty, but filled with intention. Rex remained beside him, unmoving except for the subtle rise and fall of his chest, his presence constant, as if he understood that this moment was not about action, but about realization. Jack turned his gaze toward the metal tag again, the name still visible in the dim light, and this time he did not look away. He let it settle. He let the memory come. It did not arrive all at once, not as a clear image, but as fragments, small details that connected slowly, like pieces of something long buried beginning to surface. A voice, steady and familiar. A presence beside him in a place far from here. A promise made in a moment that had not seemed important at the time, but now echoed with a weight he could no longer ignore. Jack exhaled deeply, his breath visible again in the cooling night air, and reached for the next sheet of paper, unfolding it with the same care, the same deliberate attention, as before. The handwriting continued unchanged, but the tone was different now, more direct, more personal, as if the writer had moved past explanation and into something closer to truth. Jack's eyes moved across the lines, slower now, more deliberate, and as he read, the connection sharpened, no longer distant, no longer uncertain. The letter spoke of a choice, one that had been made years ago, not out of fear, but out of necessity, a decision to hide something not because it was dangerous, but because it mattered too much to be left exposed. Jack felt his chest tighten again, not with confusion, but with understanding beginning to take shape. The land, the sealed wall, the case, none of it had been random. It had been a message. A continuation of something that had never truly ended. Rex shifted slightly, placing his head gently against Jack's arm, and Jack paused, resting his hand briefly on the dog's neck, grounding himself before continuing. The letter spoke of time, of distance, of the certainty that things change but do not disappear, and as Jack read those words, something inside him responded, not as a thought, but as a recognition of truth he had lived without fully acknowledging. He reached the final lines of the second page, and this time, when he finished, he did not look away. He held the paper steady, his eyes fixed on the last sentence, letting it settle completely before lowering it slowly. The canyon stretched around him, vast and silent, but it no longer felt distant. It felt connected, as if the land itself had been part of the story all along, holding it, protecting it, waiting for the moment it would be understood. Jack looked back toward the opening in the rock, the narrow passage that led into the hidden space. And for the first time, he saw it not as something to explore, but as something to step into, not physically, but in meaning. The past was no longer behind him. It was here. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears turning toward the darkness, then back to Jack, as if confirming what Jack already knew. This was not finished. Not yet. Jack folded the papers carefully, placing them back into the case for a moment, then picked up the tag once more, holding it firmly now, not as an object, but as something that carried weight beyond itself. "I remember," he said quietly, the words steady, certain, and as they left him, the final piece of the question that had followed him since he arrived shifted into place, no longer asking why he had been brought here, but what he was meant to do next. Jack remained seated for a long moment after the words left his mouth, the metal tag resting firmly in his hand, no longer distant, no longer just an object, but something anchored in truth, something that had waited patiently until he was ready to face it. The canyon stretched around him under a sky now filled with stars, the kind of clear desert night that revealed more than it concealed, and for the first time since he had arrived, Jack did not feel like a visitor in this place. He felt like he belonged to the moment, to the reason he had been brought here. Rex shifted beside him, then slowly stood, his posture changing, no longer watchful, but calm, as if the tension that had guided him to the sealed wall had finally eased. Jack noticed that immediately, and it settled something inside him, a quiet confirmation that the discovery was not just about finding something hidden, but about understanding it. He looked down at the case again, at the papers carefully folded inside, at the fabric that had been preserved, and then back toward the opening in the rock, the space that had held all of it for so long without disturbance. The wind moved softly through the canyon, brushing against the stone, carrying a low, steady sound that no longer felt empty, but complete. Jack reached forward, placing the metal tag gently back into the case, not as something he was putting away, but as something he was returning to its place with intention. He adjusted the papers carefully, making sure they rested the way they had before, then paused with his hand hovering over the contents, his breath steady, his mind clear in a way it had not been in years. This was not about taking anything with him. This was about acknowledging what had been left, what had been trusted to remain until it could be understood. Rex stepped closer again, his shoulder brushing lightly against Jack's arm, and Jack gave a faint nod, as if responding to something unspoken. "We leave it as it was," he said quietly, his voice steady, certain, not questioning anymore. He closed the case slowly, the lid settling into place with a soft, final sound, and for a moment he rested his hand on top of it, feeling the weight, not as something to carry, but as something already carried within him. Then he turned, leaning toward the opening in the rock, and carefully guided the case back through the gap, placing it exactly where it had been before, on the carved stone ledge inside the hidden space. He adjusted it slightly, aligning it with the markings on the wall, the same markings that now made sense in a way they had not before, not as decoration, but as a message, a map of memory left behind for the right person to understand. When he pulled his hand back, he did not rush to seal the opening immediately. Instead, he sat there for a second, looking into the darkness, not searching anymore, not questioning, just acknowledging what was there, what had been there all along. Rex stood beside him, quiet, steady, his gaze following Jack's, and together they held that moment without needing to fill it with words. Finally, Jack reached for the loose stone he had removed earlier, lifting it carefully and placing it back into position, pressing it into the seam until it settled naturally, blending again with the surrounding rock. He brushed away the loose dust with his hands, smoothing the surface, not to hide it completely, but to restore it, to leave it as it had been meant to remain. When he finished, he leaned back slightly, studying the wall, and there was no sign of what had been revealed, no indication of the space behind it, only the quiet face of stone under the night sky. Jack stood slowly, his movements unhurried, grounded, and looked out across the canyon once more, the vastness of it no longer overwhelming, but open, steady, like something he could finally move through without carrying the weight he had brought with him. Rex stepped forward, then paused, glancing back at Jack as if to check that he was ready, and Jack gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice lighter now, not empty, but clear. They turned together, walking back toward the truck, their footsteps quiet against the gravel, the night stretching out ahead of them, and behind them, the sealed wall remained, not forgotten, not lost, but complete, holding its story exactly where it belonged, while Jack carried forward the part that had always been his to keep.